Thanks y'all for making it to another recording. Earlier today, I think Latifa had shared me on a couple of articles for uh, basically this new study had come out that as of this month, housing is now unaffordable for a record half of all U.S. renters. And I was like, what more timely article could have come out for this particular recording? And I wanted to do this topic actually because I think it was a year ago, might have been 2 years ago at this point. I can't even remember. But I saw that Lewis Hamilton, who's a Formula One driver, sold his Tribeca, New York, which is a Manhattan borough apartment for $49.5 million. And I was like, that's a lot of money, of course. And everyone was like celebrating. What a great flip. He had owned the apartment since like 2017. And it went from $43.9 million to $49.5 million. So he made like $6 million off of this apartment. And the thing that stuck out to me was that he basically had never stepped foot in this apartment. He just like sat on it for all those years. And during that whole course, we had all this stuff about people that were homeless and they like were in these hotel rooms in like the Upper West Side and in the Upper East Side, and neighborhoods were like really mad that all these people are occupying all this space. And we had a migrant crisis that is still ongoing with lots of people that are migrating to New York City, not having the right accommodations. We're in the midst of winter, and I was just like, why is this like a conversation that just happens at the most like local level? This should be like a worldwide scandal. But because it's New York and it's because of the expectations of this city, I feel like everyone just jumped over it and they were like, whoa, awesome, $50 million, another win for like Lewis Hamilton. And for me, I was just like, that's a loss for all of us. Like that is a crap load of money. That is like a house that could have been shelter for like a whole family. But no, people just get to do like speculative market with like something that is so important to our everyday life. So that's kind of the backdrop of just wanting to do this episode. And I feel like it would have been great to have some guests on for this, but we can go so many different places from here that I feel like we can start here and then do another one. But yeah, so that's kind of the backdrop of like the episode. I didn't know if y'all had kind of things that you wanted to talk about or add into this episode before we jump in.
Well, as a team of the three of us being relatively low income bi-coastal elites, in that we have people in New York and the LA area here, recognizing that we've sort of chosen to be in places where housing is more difficult, right? And I think we all understand that, and there are reasons why we want to be in places that tend to be more expensive, which is, kind of a privilege to choose to be in these places, at least for us, considering that I'm speaking for the three of us, but none of us are born in the current, we're not born and raised in the cities that we live in now. That being said, I do think there is a helpful perspective that we can have being relatively not super rich people in places where it's pretty advantageous to be rich to live there. And particularly with New York, and I'm sure, Kata, you can explain more about what it's like near where you live. The reality of a large middle class being able to live within the city and not being pushed out to the outer boroughs and the burbs is just something that's becoming less and less of a possibility, to the point where it's a conversation me and my wife have all the time, like constantly, near daily, about like, how long do we stay here for? With all the things that we love about living in New York City, it's really difficult. And I don't think it has to be that way. There's lots of clear examples with housing policy is the reason why we're in the situation where there isn't a route for lower or middle class people to thrive in the most expensive cities in the country.
Totally. Yeah. No, I'm interested. I'm excited to talk about the topic. I feel like I'm glad you mentioned the migrant crisis, Mikkel, because I think that's something I'm really interested to bring forward. I do wish we had time to bring on speakers, but I feel like it's, maybe we can, with some of the questions that arise today, we could see if any folks are interested in like a follow-up conversation in some way, shape, or form. But I do think that it's also important to point out that so much of the migrant crisis is being fueled by the governors in southern states like Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott, because there was a really interesting NPR story recently that talked about how the reaction that is happening, like the way that Eric Adams is particularly reacting to the migrant crisis and the houselessness crisis in New York. It has like a direct correlation with what these like Republican governors want. So just like the ways in which even we're fueling our own houselessness and migration crisis by creating chaos
Mhm.
in so many ways. And it's actually really impacting the policies for houseless folks because of I think that in New York there's the new like 30-day you can only stay in a shelter for 30 days. So it's just like we're moving towards criminal. I mean, I think, Mikhail, what a great topic to talk about because we're on the precipice of criminalizing
Mhm.
being houseless. And I think that that's a really deep concern. It's something we should all be deeply concerned about. So
Yeah.
I'm
Uh,
excited to dive into the conversation.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, as listeners of Upon Request, I think our whole thing has been we're just a bunch of 30 somethings or getting there, trying to live in a world that feels like it is in complete opposition to our values. And I have been someone who's worked in like housing justice movements, even in Boston, trying to get tenants, housing rights groups, and you know, renters to like form their own types of pseudo unions to kind of push back against like these slumlord landlords. And yeah, it's like you all are on this journey with us, and it would be really interesting to hear from wherever you are, like what are the ways this is showing up for you? Because I think that this is the most concerning part, is that it's almost expected in some of these coastal cities, but the way that we've seen private equity start buying up in the Midwest, start doing overdevelopment, start using, former boom and bust cities that have like lived out their trajectory post
Mhm.
like Western expansion and industrialization in this country, are now starting to feel that the impact of this move away from the coast and actually come into like the center of this country in places where there are not a lot of drastic wealth building opportunities. So welcome back to another episode of Upon Request, where we're trying to tackle these issues and have conversation and keep it really squarely about the people and the ways that these institutions are affecting everyday people. Um, and as you guys are saying, like, yeah, this is occurring in the backdrop of a major housing crisis. This is one of those things that always intersects with other problems. I saw that Greg Abbott even recently. We're in the end of January right now, so I'm not sure when this will go out. But Greg Abbott recently put out something about we're dealing with a full on kind of like conflict on the southern border, and so there's this huge kind of like civil war moment that's feeling like it's erupting on the Texas southern Texas border, where a governor wants to go against the federal government on how we deal with a migrant crisis and going way outside of his boundaries. The thing about like moving people around, sending people up to Martha's Vineyard from Florida that are folks that are escaping violence, escaping security issues, escaping just like the impacts of like an overly burdensome capitalist system and how it's affecting economies globally with the rise of fascism and all this stuff. It's so inhumane that I'm like, it's really hard to see just the headlines and not want to dig
Mhm.
a little bit deeper. But it's also really scary to dig a little bit deeper because I'm like, I don't know if I can hold all that. Like, I don't know if I can like read that and hold it any more than what everyone else is doing, just because it feels so much like it's not within our grasp. So I feel like, yeah, this topic is important for many reasons. I feel like it has implications on the future of housing. It has implications on the landscape of home ownership, right? It really breaks apart this idea of the American dream, right? And the American dream has always been the American dream for some and not all. But even more so, there's a whole generation of people that I don't think that they're even worrying about home ownership. They're worrying about rents. They're worrying about affordability of rent, and that's concerning, because now we have people that are spending so much money to change their qualifications, go to university, put themselves in crazy amounts of debt, with the hopes that on the other side it comes with some sort of stability and sustainability at a certain age, and that's not even promised anymore. And so, yeah, I think all of this is starting to kind of culminate in this really, really toxic system and setup. And I think that it's not just the coast anymore. I think it is really just even the heartlands of the U.S., and it's going to get a lot worse. So yeah, kind of a long diatribe to get into the meat of the conversation. But my big question is, how have you seen this maybe play out from like a housing crisis perspective where you are? I think me and Eric have like maybe lots of examples from the New York perspective, but maybe we can start with Kato and hear how it's been over there in LA.
Totally. Well, I will start with the caveat. And thanks so much, Mikkel, for just doing such a thorough backdrop on why we feel like it's really important for us to talk about this topic. And I would say one of the first places that I'll start with is I live in Irvine, so I live in Orange County, which is about an hour south of LA. And it is one of the one of the wealthiest counties in the country, also one of the most conservative, which is really, that correlation is really fascinating. But I would say first, to say the language that I like to use, and I'm just, I like to think about language, and I like to really prompt and oftentimes just, think about the ways in which language really affects us and has power. I use the term, like folks typically say someone experiencing homelessness, like in talking about centering the humanity of folks. I will use houseless. I think that this is something that folks within this community typically use as well. So in case folks are confused about the different verbiage that's being thrown around, I typically use houseless to mean folks that are experiencing homelessness. And I think, I live in a really unique place in the country in terms of like LA is experiencing probably one of the worst houselessness crises in the country. And I live in a place that is very close to that. But I also live in a place where the accessibility to those things and to seeing those things is also very far. So people in my community actually do not see how bad the crisis is, because there is this model of it's actually really disgusting, but whenever there are houseless folks in this particular area, they get picked up and driven to the closest town over that will receive folks in shelters. So first to say that I get this like coastal elite sentiment, because I mean it really is hard to get past this this idea that all of these wealthy communities are better than like all of the other communities because these communities have like chaos in them, and like we don't have that. But really it's because of the violent expulsion of people from these regions, and the violent expulsion also happens through housing prices. So the housing prices in Southern California have skyrocketed. Like I can speak more from that angle on LA because I will not pretend to know anything about the LA houselessness crisis. I would rather not spread any misinformation, and I think I would definitely invite any of our listeners. I'm new to the area. I've been here for like a year and a half now. And I would really, if any of our listeners have a lot of knowledge on LA, please reach out. I actually would really love to hear folks' takes on it. But my personal take so far is more from like the big picture, very curious because I just moved here. But the housing prices, like the medium the median amount of money that you need to have to buy a home in California is like way over $100,000. The average home is about $900,000 where I live. So like, I mean, that's 3 times my college tuition, and I'm still paying for my college tuition. I had like over $100,000 in debt. And it's like, I would definitely say one of the things that I have learned about Southern California is that it's a crisis fueled by many, many things, but the growing inequality within the city of LA is vast. And this inequality is visceral. Whenever I do drive into LA, it is very clear. And the way in which the city has handled things has not always improved the situation. So I would just say that's my experience so far of the crisis in Southern California. I would say we're in a really unique place because of the weather. Also, I think more folks can be outside for longer. And the thing that I've really learned is a lot of these places that we call and we've heard called like tent cities, like a lot of those folks are actually really like the way that they've been forcibly removed, they've been forcibly removed from homes that they have created. And that's one of the pieces that is most heartbreaking to me, is that folks make home with whatever resources and whatever strength and might they have left in a world that has really left them behind. And then we just go and trample on that. Like, you know, you build a home out of your community, and then here comes the state to sanction you and to punish you for creating community, which really only makes us safer. So we're really also creating like a crisis of safety in so many ways. And the safety of houseless folks is the top priority within that conversation as well.
There was actually, so the last time I went to LA, I think we had started the podcast and we had like the account, and so I had it on my phone. I think I had accidentally taken a story of me flipping off the LAPD like new police headquarters. And the reason that I was flipping it off is because we were like in Little Tokyo, like staying in a hotel over there. Was there for like a wedding, so it was like kind of like a whole week of trying to explore and like enjoy LA. LA is gigantic. It is sprawling. Yeah. While Manhattan is like huge in its own right, and New York City is huge in its own right, the sprawl of LA is like on another level. I've really never experienced anything like that until I have, you know, maybe gone to like some other really major cities internationally. But the reason that I was so frustrated and so upset is because you see this like, I can't even put into words. It is one of the ugliest buildings, but also one of the biggest police buildings I've ever seen, straight up. And it is across the street from Skid Row like strips of people living in tents. And I was just like, how is this juxtaposition so clearly in our face? We have enough money for this giant police headquarters with one of the most abusive, one of the most violent, one of the like highest cases of transgressions against its own community in the LAPD, the LA Police Department, and it's across the street from like hundreds of people living in tents. And maybe like at the time that we were getting out there and like kind of leaving, I think that they had just gone through another sweep. So the amount of tents that we saw at the beginning versus at the end was like very different. But this is the reality of the situation, is like there is a real stark prioritization of like what we are willing to put money and resources towards and what is upheld by the system of like our sense of safety, right? There's no safety is not community. Safety is force, right? It's like you enforce safety. But I think of safety, and I think that what you were talking about, Kato, is like exactly right. Safety is how we prioritize the humanity within our policies, our systems, our budgets. Housing insecurity is something that comes from a warped disposition to people's lives. Like we're talking about people like, and there's so many false equivalencies that get created. Like people are homeless because they have addiction. Yes, maybe some people do have addiction, but is that the right like approach to people with addiction is to just let them not have housing, let them not have stability.
Yeah.
And doesn't that kind of compound the issue of addiction, right? No one's talking about the fact that what percentage of people that got addicted to opiates in, the Boston area can be directly traced back to the opiates that Purdue Pharma put out into the world, right? Where is the accountability for them to provide housing in perpetuity for those folks? Provide the public welfare that they made it harder for cities to supply because it expanded and overexpanded beyond. It was like kind of like an artificial inflation of what a system can deal with, and so I just think that there's a lot of concepts within this that are all about assumptions, and a lot of it is also about a real brainwashing of our society to think that the only way we can have X, Y, and Z is through police, through distancing, and through silencing, and through invisibilizing things that we just don't want to put our hands on, which is houselessness, addiction, domestic abuse, like all of these things that people experience and that force them into these conditions. And some of it could be, just decision making, but I don't think that people should suffer for one or two decisions that put them in a bad spot. I am staunchly against that system. And I think we're also seeing, this housing crisis kind of be exacerbated a little bit. And I do wonder how much of this is like corporate office, getting people back in the office propaganda, but this idea of like remote work, moving people around to places that are more affordable because now they can remotely work, and now it's displacing people and displacing affordability. And this is where this idea of the private equity firms buying up entire housing supplies all across the country is really coming in, is that now the ownership is going into the hands of people that are trying to flip a profit because they can't do it based off of the office spaces anymore and where they have been getting all their money. So there's been a huge stark shift, I think. But I don't know if you have any thoughts too, Eric, on what we've been kind of seeing. I think you're in like a unique spot in being in kind of the northern part of Manhattan. I'm over here in Brooklyn, so I feel like I don't see as much of the push or flow, but yeah.
And just super quickly, sorry, Eric, before, just to paint a picture of what the houselessness crisis is in LA, as of 2023, there's 75,500 houseless folks, and that is a 9% rise in the year 2023 alone, just to say.
Definitely troubling. I would say I do have a bit of a unique, I don't think I have like a very unique perspective, but like quite literally perspective when I go outside. It is kind of unique based on where I live. I live on Park Avenue, which when you say it that way, it's like, ooh, I live on Park Avenue. And it sounds really ritzy. And in a lot of south of where I live, it absolutely is. It has a reputation for being one of the more affluent streets to live on. I actually live outside of my door is the end of where the boulevard is, where it basically goes from this nice open green park that goes down the boulevard, why it's called Park Avenue, to train tracks. And it's a very key distinction between the Upper East Side and East Harlem. And one of those forever examples of how infrastructure is designed based on community and who lives there. So you have this really nice park that's south of 97th Street for the wealthy Upper East Siders. You have exposed open Amtrak and commuter rails for all of East Harlem and the Bronx to enjoy. It's like it slaps you in the face a little bit, and just the inequality is pretty extreme. And there's a couple things about New York that do make it different than other cities in America. In particular, the right to shelter laws that have been part of New York City's legal system for the past 4 decades, where there's a legal obligation of the city to house people, which is not something that most cities have. That is also part of the reason why governors in the South, in particular Abbott and DeSantis, are sending large groups of migrants to New York City, Um, and to be honest, it is part of the reason why a lot of migrants are coming to New York City, is that there is a requirement for housing and shelter. There's a legal requirement for the city to do their best to house people. In the wake of the current migrant crisis, both the governor and the mayor are actively campaigning to basically remove the right to shelter law that currently exists. The reasoning, of course, as they say, is there's a lack of housing, we don't have room. And in the available shelters, that is true. With the shelters that have been created, I actually live really close to one. It's 2 blocks away. Contrary to what you see on the news, at least by me, extremely quiet. There's no protests outside. There's no problems. I haven't seen any like drastic increase in crime. What I see is families and little kids on bikes when I walk by. Like this overly dramatic sort of sensationalized villainization of migrants is just like it's not the reality of at least what I see in the day-to-day. And then there's the part about the open, like, so we're out of space. We're out of shelter space. So we need to get rid of the right to shelter. That's the only option. Meanwhile, most of billionaires in a row, I wouldn't say most, but there's a high level of vacancy in the most expensive properties in Manhattan. To what Mikkel was talking about earlier, where a lot of these properties are not even for housing realistically. They're investments. They're just another way for people to diversify their assets and to, it's an investment. It's not actual housing for some people. So we have this problem that is totally constructed of a lack of housing. Meanwhile, there's all of these office buildings that many people don't work in anymore. And the housing that is being created, so little of it is affordable housing, even with the regulations that do exist that require certain levels of affordable housing or provide incentives for it. The reality is it's not enough. And what's being created is very much for the wealthiest people, because it's like most thing when it comes to private equity firms. How can we turn this into a quick profit? Not the solution here isn't how do we make more housing available. That's not what people are actively trying to do. They're trying to figure out, what do we do with the property that exists in Manhattan, and how do we make as much money off it as possible?
It's really such a deep kind of web of influence that I think about when I think about how we get to this place when it comes to housing. Right now, whenever you see like private equity money flowing about, always should be a flare of concern, because private equity is probably the highest level of must return exactly 5% plus to our investors. Like, if there's no profitability, private equity is not there. And private equity also works really hard to squeeze profit out of whatever investments they have. So that's always like a flare of concern. And I think that's why I'm so concerned about private equity moving into the middle of the country. Like it's one thing to be on the coastal parts of the country where there is this cycle of I don't think this is like a shocking claim to make, but I feel like people want to live in these coastal cities more because there's just like more jobs, there's more, public infrastructure, there's just like an ease to living within these cities that I think is much more desirable than going to some of these other parts of the country. But now you're taking what the benefits are of living in those places, of like community, being more rural, maybe having like kind of a slower pace of life, making things more about like the most democratic level of spending, which is that things survive because people will move money to like make it survive, right? Whereas I think a lot of the profitability of things that happen in the coasts are artificial in some senses and very much not replicable. Like, you can't replicate Soho anywhere in the world. Like, it's just not going to happen because there's a constant flow of tourists. There is people that come to New York. There is a deep level of cultural kind of salience that has like moved through media and through the mainstream of like, you go to Manhattan to spend money and look rich. Like that has been established. You're not going to establish that in St. Louis, Missouri. St. Louis, Missouri is really cool because it has City Museum. It's got great Southern barbecue. Anyway, I could say I like St. Louis, Missouri. I do. But it is not New York, and it can't uphold
The
kind
way
of
you
the
say
system.
Missouri is wild. I just have to point it out. I don't know.
Missouri?
Yeah.
Is that crazy?
Wait,
I
say it one
think
more
so.
time. Missouri.
Missouri. I'm saying it weird. I
say
understand that.
Missouri.
I'm
Yeah.
not
How
going
do
to try
you
to
say
correct
it?
you. I just had to point it out that it was
Hey,
fascinating
you know
to
what?
hear you say that.
Someone leave us a phonetic guidance on how to say Missouri right. I feel like people say Mizzou,
Please.
right? Missouri?
Missoula. Missoula?
That's Montana.
No, that's
Right.
Montana. LOL. Please cut that out. No.
No, we're
Sorry,
keeping that in.
Montanans. And Missouri.
But I do think that like there is New York can sustain that growth, that like boom and bust cycle. It has and it will. It's got lots of universities. There's like, a market that I think has been established within New York that it can sustain that in some form. But what is happening right now is that these companies, these corporations, these conglomerates, these groups of investors are creating like an artificial level of growth that no city can sustain. Like this is impossible. I'm just saying this right now. It is impossible to move the market the way that it is and expect people to stay around here. It's also impossible to maintain the types of infrastructure that you have for businesses because now businesses can't afford. And now it's only one type of business that can afford it, which is heavily invested like angel investor blank street coffee or like you're just like losing a lot of the integrity of the one-off, the brick and mortar, the mom and pop shops, and you're replacing it with this overly chain franchise kind of mentality that one is not good for the city of New York and it's not good for the country and it's really not good for the world. Like this conglomeratization is going to destroy the fabric of what we enjoy about places, right? People walk down in San Francisco and they think about those, the the pretty ladies or that like hill of houses. Am I saying the wrong thing? Might be.
And I know what you're talking
Full
about.
House.
Yeah. That like that row of houses that is like unique to
On
San
the super
Francisco.
steep street.
Super steep street.
Yeah.
It's built after the fire in San Francisco. It's not that it's old. It's just that it's unique and it's like beautified and people had like a certain individual spin on it. The brownstones in Brooklyn, like those are quickly going away. I live in one that's like a reformed brownstone that doesn't look anything like the neighbors, and that is like ruining the uniqueness and the integrity of culture, I think. And so I think that there's something like really violent about not just these policies but this like flow of how housing insecurity moves, where it's like we are destroying people, right? We're breaking people down to their like worst level of like sustainability. We're making it really hard for people to show up as their full human selves. And then on top of that, we're desecrating what people have built, all in the sake of like this profit margin. And I think like the more and more that we like kind of pick away at the world around us as like young people, especially people with like the values that we hold, I think we'll see more and more we are getting the worst end of the stick. Like quite literally our generation is just getting absolute dog shit for what we put in a way that I think there's other generations that have dealt with their major issues, right? But there was a time where there was a window where I think the return was so high for a group of people, and I'm just going to be very clear, white people. There was white families benefited a lot from a steep era of like peace and prosperity for American like culture and systems. And as soon as like I think brown people come to a place of like starting to share in that pie, like I think that's when it starts turning. And I'm not trying to give a history lesson. I'm just like giving my utmost frustration and just like, why is this the way that things have gone? And how are we going to buck this trend. And I don't have a lot of tools. Like, I think a lot of it is like forming like tenant unions, really fighting back against this like corporate landlord structure. I think starting to hit private equity where it makes it completely unprofitable to do what they're doing. But also there's like a certain level of like, where are the government agencies to step in and set up policies that like look out for people? When is that going to happen? So yeah, I just am like in a deep state of frustration, and I feel like when you see places in like Portland, Maine, where there's houses going for like $1 million, like never in a million years should Portland, Maine be in a place of like everyone's trying to buy $1 million houses. It's just not the place for that. It is a small little town that has moved into the city like status, but it's not really a city, right? It is not going to sustain that. And so this is just going to look worse and worse for a lot of places that you wouldn't have expected at all. So yeah, I don't know.
Just poor Portland, Maine, catching strays. It's not even a city. You know, it's not even a place. Just kidding.
Aww.
It's a
so
beautiful
insulted
place.
right now. Sorry, I know I love Portland, Maine. But
I love
$1
Portland.
million for a house, like
and that's like a regular instance. That's a regular occurrence now.
Yeah.
What I would say is what happens in big cities is connected to places like Portland and other smaller cities, though, because as this trend of people who earn high wages in major cities, particularly now with the expansion of remote work, places like Missoula you brought up earlier, is the housing prices are going up dramatically because of people with remote jobs moving to more rural locations because they're affordable, making it harder for the people who lived there beforehand to afford what they previously had. So it just to say it's all connected.
Yeah.
And even the opposite, where there's more young professional people who want to move out of the suburbs and into the cities, you have like the example around Kensington in Philadelphia, where around Temple University in particular, there's a mass movement to get poor people out of new developments which are surrounding Temple University in Philadelphia. And who's going to buy these houses? It's not the people who grew up in the Kensington area. It's people that are coming into the city. And all of this, the profits, the cost of owning these properties has gone way down in the past couple of years due to levels of crime and addiction and homelessness or houselessness around the Kensington area. It's just the classic story of gentrification. You tank the pricing, make it really unaffordable, remodel everything, sell it to a bunch of white people from the suburbs who come on in, and it's a new community that's revitalized with coffee shops and CBD stores.
I was gonna say, how have we not said the G word? Like gentrification. Like that is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
You know, and I feel like I definitely struggled a lot with that post grad because I lived in East Boston. Just for background, my family has a historical connection to East Boston. There's a large Colombian community, and my family, I grew up in Columbia, but then moved to Providence, and a lot of my family, there's a big connection between the Providence and Boston communities. And even so, I was coming in when I moved to East Boston at an economic advantage for sure, because I was college educated, and it was a rapidly gentrifying community. And one of the things that bothered me, I had this incident. I was working at a restaurant as a server in East Boston. It was a new restaurant that opened up. And all of this is to say, just even this gentrification pisses me off so much for many, many, many reasons. But just the attitudes oftentimes of the entitlement of people coming into these communities to say that they're improving them when really they're just ousting anybody that cannot afford to live there. East Boston looks completely different from when I lived there. And at this restaurant where I was working at, I remember it was a newer restaurant, and and mind you, I like East Boston is where all of my like Colombians are at, right? Like I started to really get to know my neighbors. It was like one of the first times that I felt really, really integrated in a community in Boston. Because otherwise, in college, I lived in the Fenway area because that's where I went to school, and Boston is super segregated. So it was the first time I felt like a really deep sense of belonging. And I remember working at this restaurant, and the manager was like, "Oh yeah, we're really trying to encourage like all the new people that are coming here. Like this is for like the new people or whatever." So I end up like, talking to one of the regulars, and her perspective on gentrification was literally, "Oh my God, we're just improving this neighborhood." Like even just the lack of self-examination. I mean, I knew I was gentrifying in East Boston, and I'm Colombian, and I felt very deeply part of that community. And I feel like oftentimes even ourselves, like I question within the larger conversation of housing, where do I fit in, and what like actor am I in this so often. And I think I just wanted to bring that forward because as y'all were talking, I'm just like having personal reflections too. I'm like, well, we're talking about gentrification, and we're talking about the like wages are not catching up with the rise of rent. That is like one of the biggest issues that we're facing right now as a country. And because so many cities are becoming so unaffordable, not only like, for example, I could even use the big city to small city comparison that you talked about, Eric. Providence is super unaffordable now. Providence was never unaffordable. Like nobody, people went to Providence because, Brown is there, Rizzi's there. And it's honestly, for if you don't know Providence, it's a really freaking cool artistic city. The arts and the social justice scene are very intertwined, and it's a really, really awesome community. But now, because rents are getting more expensive in Boston, and the commuter rail is, I commuted from Providence to Boston for an entire year because I had to move back home with my parents, and like it is now like all of the people that are commuting into Boston, the transportation has gone up, rent has gone up in Providence. And not only is there this trend of like, suburbia to city or city to suburbia or like big city to little city, more affordable city, then we're talking about like international gentrification, which I think is like a movement that perhaps is being bred out of the unaffordability of housing in the US and remote work. Like people are just like, well, fuck it. I'm going to go work in a country where it's much cheaper for me to live. I'm not paying taxes here. Like it's definitely creating. And I also say that as someone that I moved back to Colombia during the pandemic to be with like some of my family and stuff. And even though that's where my family's from, I still felt that guilt of like, holy crap, it's so much more affordable to live here. I mean, I'm paying like less than half of what I used to pay in the US. And I understand why it's like such a appealing choice for people, but God, we cannot export it like this. Like we can't. It's just getting so out of hand. And just to say also, like another piece of the conversation that I wanted to bring in is in 2022, 5 residents left New York. I don't know what percentage of that is New York City, but I know a lot of residents left New York City. So we know there's a lot of empty buildings around New York. And we also know that a lot of it is tied to this larger conversation of the economy and keeping your investments, right? There's so many empty luxury apartments because they are a way that people get tax breaks. They're a way that people find tax loopholes. While we have folks on the streets, while we have kids, women, children, men, any type of like non-binary folks, queer folks, we have so many folks on the streets, and we have these like entire buildings of empty apartments. It is a crisis of morality. It is not a crisis of like, it's a crisis fueled by poor morality and ethics, and one of like our lack of empathy and care for each other. Because I think one of the things that you said, Mikkel, oftentimes we have these images of houseless folks, these stereotypes, that there's like drug use and all these things, which like, of course there are all of those things, but there are all of those things in normal life too. Like you go to any household, I'm sure folks are doing drugs all the time. Like why are we focusing on that particular aspect for these folks. And then at the same time, we're talking about eviction, like wrongful evictions. We're talking about medical costs that put you in, like, we're talking about the healthcare system in this country. The healthcare system in this country puts people in irreversible debt oftentimes. And so many people that are experiencing houselessness right now is probably because of some sort of unexpected debt from like having to take care of themselves medically in some way, shape, or form. And we just like, policing makes it worse, prisons make it worse. It's just like, there's so many factors. And now I'm just like, I feel like going mostly on a rant. So I'm just gonna stop there. But I definitely, like, one of my biggest questions is like, we have enough housing. So what's up? Like, what is going on?
Do we? It's a good question, actually. I think that is part of the question is, do we have enough housing in certain areas, though? And
in certain areas is a good question. Yeah, totally.
Because overall, we do have enough housing, like, in the world, theoretically. But that's where you end up with something I think you mentioned, which is sort of this neo-imperialism of especially people going from... But I think a great example is we all went to Mexico City a couple, like 2 years ago. I can't remember how long ago it was. It was lovely. I had a great time. Would I like to live there if I knew that my presence wasn't a problem? It'd be nice. I'll just be honest. I really, really liked Mexico City. It might be one of my favorite places that I've ever been. Exactly. We all want to, right? And I think it's actually our generation, largely, in certain ways. I don't want to say it's the problem from a systemic standpoint of like, we're the ones making the crisis, but we are generally sort of the pawns in the crisis that's causing a lot of the gentrification that we're talking about.
Yeah.
It's people in their 30s into like late 30s having families. They want to get into a stable place. That's how you get Bed-Stuy being a completely different neighborhood than it used to be. Because gentrification isn't just a matter of pushing people out. It's this nearly, like, it's so tempting to draw you in. That is a huge part of it, is like making certain communities, certain neighborhoods seem like the only option for certain middle income people. Like New York City is a great example of that, especially gentrification in New York City. There's a reason why lots of people who are not from Bushwick and are not from Bed-Stuy are moving there. It's because the community is rapidly changing, and developers and real estate is incentivizing that and is actively trying to bring new people in, kind of like you mentioned earlier, Kato, about East Boston.
Yeah.
And a wiser person than me, I was talking to a good friend of ours, who I'll put in the chat later. I was talking about Brooklyn and like how much I would love to live in certain areas of Brooklyn, but like Bed-Stuy is just a line I'm not willing to cross as a white dude in America who moved to New York. I can't do it. It's just part of like my childhood where I'm just like, at least from a cultural standpoint, like it doesn't make sense to me that I should like, it just seems wrong. Like it's a symbolic example of gentrification that's so, I personally can't do it. That being said, when I look at available stuff that I could afford, every single apartment or house I would like, for the most part, is in Bed-Stuy or nearby or a similar neighborhood. So it's hard just to say, to what you mentioned earlier, Kato. It's like how you said you felt a little conflicted. We're being pulled towards these places.
Totally.
At least lots of us are. And so it's partially, on the individual to not do that, but there is a larger system at play. It kind of gets to like the plastic straw thing. Like I don't want to get around individual responsibility about like making choices. Like I strongly encourage people not to move into neighborhoods that are actively gentrifying. Like if you can avoid it, you should try to avoid it. Right. But there is a larger system at play.
Yeah, and just to add really quickly to that, super fast, because I want to hear your thoughts, Mikkel, on all of this too. But you actually brought up a really good point, Eric, and I think it like 2 points. One about the choice, the pull that we have. And I just want to point out how much choice we personally feel entitled to and how much choice we don't give to folks that are experiencing houselessness. Because I think that's another piece. Like, maybe there is enough housing, but not everybody wants to live in the places where the housing is, right? And one of the things that a very good friend of all of ours actually, oh, well, Eric, you've met my friend Paola, right?
Mm-hmm.
I will call on her. I will give her a shout out. My friend Paola used to work at an organization called AIDS Action in Boston. And she worked as one of their housing coordinators, helping folks, because we know that one of the first horizons of intervention for folks experiencing AIDS is you need a home to take care of yourself. Like housing, y'all, is just such a fundamental human right. And maybe we don't have all the housing, but we have all the resources to make that happen, and we just don't do it. And something that she shared with me, and I thought was a really important nuance, is the way that we view, because there might have been moments, and maybe folks that work within the field, like there are moments where someone gets placed in a house that's really far away from their community and they don't want to live there. Like and we give such lack of agency to the folks that are actually experiencing this crisis. And I think it's so important to remind ourselves how much as a society, it's accepted for us to have choice as to where to live, including in neighborhoods where we probably shouldn't be. But for houseless folks, people would probably be like, well, they're getting housing. Why would they feel so like, why, they should just be grateful. And it's like, we need to stop that. Like, no, folks should not be grateful. It's their human right. And like folks want to live in places where their communities are, where they're comfortable. And I just think that I always forget what a privilege we have and how much we strip that away from folks that are, the center of and experiencing this crisis overall.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a couple things one that Eric brought up, I think this navigating the personal responsibility that we all have. I don't care what background you're from. I think that we all have a personal responsibility in this, and like the ways that we show up. What that looks like is different for everyone, right? As someone who grew up in a low-income low-income household, I had a mom who like refused to take any type of government like welfare, but at the same time she never qualified for anything by like a hair of a margin. So like my mom, who's a single mom, having a 4-year-old and then like a 15-year-old at the time, or 16-year-old, I can't remember what age I was when my brother was 4, but like moved up to Massachusetts, and we like landed because we landed housing because we picked the market value rates, whereas like our neighbors were in low income housing or like subsidized housing in that way. And I just remember like my mom like missing it by like $500 because two kids, single mom, you had to be making under this amount. So the qualifications for like what you get support with is like really arduous for some folks. And so like, should my mom have taken a tax cut to like save X amount of dollars? Like, people, I think, reduce and simplify like the types of sacrifices that people have to make to even be covered under some of this like welfare system. And I think that it's just really interesting that entitlements for like rich people get viewed with such a positive kind of glean, but then public welfare for folks that are under hardship or struggling or dealing with like multiplicity of like issues kind of gets deemed to the side. So the personal responsibility for me, right, is that I still do have to understand that like I am a gentrifier regardless of my background, right? Regardless of my background, I owe it to my community to show up as like a good community member and to advocate for like the folks that are still experiencing that type of lifestyle. Just because I'm out of it doesn't mean that I'm like now both not responsible to make things easier for them and to now totally not a gentrifier because I've already done it. Like it's kind of this weird thing of like your personal responsibility is real. And I think that like what you were talking about, Gato, is like I think we really do not understand the journey of housing insecurity. right? And how people fluctuate between housing insecurity to houselessness to housing stable to like back. Like it's kind of the same thing with disability. Everyone at some point will face some kind of like instability in their life. Everyone at some point will be differently abled because we will all like get to that aging. But I think in this system in particular, there are some that will experience it way worse than others. And that's kind of the big traversing that I have. But I will say another thing that came up during the pandemic was actually there was this Black queer couple that was documenting their move to Bali, Indonesia. And they got a lot of backlash from people in Indonesia because the videos that they were putting out was like sidestepping taxes, doing X, Y, and Z things so that you can get the most out of the savings. And they got so much flack. And there was this huge internet beef between Black Americans, femme, non-binary, queer folks talking about the historic wrongs that like Black people have faced and how they like, why aren't you keeping that same energy with like the white people in Bali and all this stuff. And I was like, it's Indonesian people telling you not to violate their laws as they are facing the impacts of gentrification right now. And you don't know whether or not they're holding the white Balians to the same level of account. Just because they're calling out this level of accountability for this particular couple does not mean that somehow they're just not putting any energy towards other people. It's just that this one's blowing up right now because everyone is fanning the flames, right? And I think that there's something to be said about also just there's different layers of privilege. You're a privileged person coming from America making an American salary. You go to another place where there isn't that same level of privilege, where your money is now outweighing the local community 5-1, is privilege. Yes, you've been through a lot. Life is hard. And life is also hard for other people too. And so I think for me, like I just hearing y'all and like kind of just being reminded of this loop that we get into of like, well, I don't want to take responsibility for myself personally because there's a whole system at play. But then when the system comes down, now I'm like, woe is me. How did this happen to me? And it's like we have to be doing all of it at once. And it sounds really shitty to say, but it's like you have to be an advocate against the system. You have to take action when it's the systemic ways of oppression or, hitting these different issues. And specifically when it comes to housing, like really hitting back against those that are the corporate buyers, the corporate owners. And you have to take personal responsibility for the ways that you are contributing or not contributing, positive or negative, right? Like that is all part of that window of time that we have on this earth, is to like do our best, right? Show up in your best way. Do not become apathetic, because I think that is my most annoyed that I get when we talk about these really deep systemic issues, is this level of apathy, right? And I think that is what the system also encourages. Like you were saying, Eric, like the system encourages us to respond a certain way. It actually banks on us statistically responding a certain way the majority of the time. It also banks on us being apathetic towards changing anything. That's like what it relies on. So as we're kind of like wrapping up this conversation, I do want to just like reiterate, like housing doesn't have to be the way it is. Housing intersects with so many things, and fundamentally, housing is a right. People's ability to access housing, health, clothing, food would significantly change the quality of life for every person on this planet. And our ability to like let this sail into the wind as like a problem we cannot solve is not it's just not it. It's like the big pillar that if this falls, I think everything else falls. And we're seeing that with the crumbling infrastructure here in the US, how badly this is impacting people. People are fundamentally getting absolutely screwed over by the system, and all of these things have to interplay perfectly to violently displace people from where they are and to make it cruelly living in just like some of the worst conditions. And so I think that what you were saying earlier, Gato, and what you've been saying as well, Eric, is like we are subject to a system that wants this to run this course. And people fall into this in some instances more than they choose to be in this. I don't think a lot of people would choose to be in this. They make choices that they fall into, but this is something that people really don't have as much control over. And for us that do have the energy and have the stability to like take action, we should. So yeah, I think I'm like in that place that you were talking about, Gato, of just like utter rage and wanting to rant. and I want to like really solidly ground us in like, we do have the ability to change things. Look around, see where this is impacting your community. It doesn't matter if you're in Missoula, Montana, if you're in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, like there is something you can do to like right this wrong. And even if it's just, I know for me in New York, the thing that I've been doing is I'll go and buy like a pack of like socks and just like give it to some of the families that are on the street, just because we're talking about like moms with kids, right? Like if that's what I can do to make sure that they're prepared for this winter, like that's what I'll do. If it's just giving them a big chunk of money so that they can feed every single person rather than just $1, like I'm gonna do that. And when I have it, they got it. That's how we have to start thinking about this. When you have it, take a little bit of sacrifice on the rent. Sorry. Like take a little hit, because like it really is that we are displacing people by our choices and what we're willing to endure and what we're willing to advocate for. So yeah, this is not a very complete conversation. I think that there's so much more that we can be talking about, and I feel like the fact that me, Eric, and Kato are all like chomping at the bit to jump in should tell you how important of a conversation and how full of a conversation this can be. And we're really looking forward to hearing more from all of you as we kind of try to do different instances of this same conversation, because I think it does start branching out, and I think we can pick any one of the topics we covered today and do a whole episode on it. So
seriously.
so yeah, any last kind of reflections or thoughts before we wrap?
I will add in a quick one since Eric is shaking his head no, but Eric would really actually love to hear any wrap-up thoughts, but you don't have to if you don't want to. One, I know we didn't touch on the subject that much, but we very briefly at the beginning maybe might have touched upon the migration crisis, one of the biggest humanitarian crises we're facing as a country right now, and just want to say that we are oftentimes, as a country, the root causes as to why people have to leave their countries. I will say, my family having immigrated from a place where the U.S. had a presence in a civil war, there's a lot of Colombians out here with direct ties coming to the U.S. because of the way that the U.S. meddled in our country. And just to say, especially for folks that are tied to some sort of spirituality or religion, because I know that a lot of these communities can oftentimes have values that speak to taking care of folks that come to our country, or just like our own like houseless folks. Like, just remember your values and remember that we are like, our stated values, like on the Statue of Liberty, it literally says like we like clothe the I don't remember what the statement is, but it's talking about like taking care of each other, mutual. Like I think Mikkel, what you mentioned essentially was mutual aid, like participating in mutual aid, which I think is one of the really big things that we can do as communities. I know in Boston, there were these community fridges around neighborhoods. I got to participate. It's like, it was a mutual aid effort where we would buy, like, it was literally so rogue. I never actually met anyone in the organizing that was happening, but it was all done on social media. And we would literally just like bring food from our fridges, or like go food shopping and fill up the fridges with like the different necessities, and folks could come to the fridges and just open them, no questions asked. Literally anybody could, and there were like several locations around Boston. So these initiatives, y'all, are really important. We need to take care of our communities. We need to take care of each other. I think that one of the things that I really try to be careful of one approaching this issue is disempowering the people that are affected by this issue, because I think oftentimes there's this way that we communicate about folks that really dehumanizes them and makes it, adds this angle of like pity that I think actually can be pretty disrespectful. So I would just say, just remember that, these are like, we're all human beings, and we all like, we all have a stake in this. I think it really is part of collective liberation. And just to say, with the migration crisis, like, it is our direct responsibility to take care of the folks whose countries we've destabilized. So open up the goddamn borders. Like, I hope this gets used in some sort of like, I don't know, Republican bit, like open it. That's what they want. We do want open borders. Like, I do want people that are coming, that are in places where that have the violence that I came from in my own country. They have the right to seek safety for their families. So just to say that, I know there's a lot of stuff happening around the migrant crisis and houselessness. They are not making it worse. It is the policies of these states, it's the policies of these governors that are creating chaos and in the end hurting and harming violently human beings. Because, like, speaking truth to power, houselessness fueled by the state is violence. And that, like, is where I will leave my last thought, is that it is violence enacted by the state, and we should do something about it. And I'm excited to hear from listeners on this one, because I think many people have really well thought out perspectives on the issue. So stay tuned. Hopefully we'll get to invite someone really cool and that can come in, and instead of like rant, which I don't think we all ranted the whole time, but like that can bring in maybe more perspective from actually working like with those communities. I think that would be really cool and important. So if anybody is that person, reach out. We would love to hear from you.
Thanks y'all for listening. Have a good one. Peace out.
Bye y'all.